Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am very excited today to have Cass MacDonald with me, and we are going to talk about all sorts of things that people who have developed a chronic illness such as long COVID can do to help in a practical way, and all sorts of other things as well, I'm sure. So welcome to the podcast, Cass.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So to begin with, would you mind introducing yourself? So who are you and what is it that you do?
Well, obviously I'm Cass. I'm actually 46, so I'm non-binary, but I was assigned female at birth. And I say that just because obviously statistics show that women or female bodies of a certain age seem to be more prone to COVID. I'm an office-based nurse and I live in Edinburgh. I'm single and I have two furry children, both of who will probably crop up during this podcast. When I say I'm an office-based nurse, basically I work for the local health board here in Edinburgh, and I'm a surveillance nurse. So I do lots of things relating to audits and reporting, statistics and that kind of thing. And that's pretty much what I do. And I also do a little bit of research, so I'll do research into things like guidelines and all that kind of jazz.
Fantastic. Now, you've been suffering from long COVID since an infection in April 2020, which sounds like a horribly long time. It is, actually, isn't it? It is a horribly long time. Can you talk a little bit about your existing health challenges and how long COVID has sort of exacerbated them?
Before COVID, I had some pre-existing conditions. I have asthma. And I also have a condition which is variously referred to as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome hypermobility type, or joint hypermobility syndrome. As a result of that, I was diagnosed with chronic pain syndrome about 10 years ago. And I have had episodes of pain. And and it's fair to say that over the years, I've had problems with my mental health. I have what's called a major depressive disorder. Which is just basically I live with chronic depression, and sometimes it gets better of me, and most of the time I'm fine and I'm functional. I have other little bits and pieces that are going on with me, but they're mainly associated with the EDS and the asthma. And I'm autistic. And I need to remember that, because you live with a great deal of stress with autism because you're very hypersensitive. So before COVID, I was managing chronic conditions, but I was working full time, so across Monday to Friday, full hours. But I was finding that a bit challenging, and I now realise that when you're managing chronic conditions, it is a bit of an uphill battle to live, in inverted commas, a normal life. At the time, I had a cleaner just to kind of help out because I have pain, I have problems with my joints. And I was already doing things like getting the groceries in for just doing weekly shopping online, getting them delivered to the door, and generally trying to avoid people as much as possible. Just most of the time because I was just kind of tired, but I was able to go on holiday and do all that kind of thing. And I was very aware that things like heat would set me off and all that kind of thing. So I kind of knew triggers. And then I got COVID. And unlike a lot of people, it was a bit difficult for me, being on a lot of medication, to pinpoint the symptoms, because I didn't have a cough and I didn't have a particularly high fever all the time. Terrible headache, and I was absolutely exhausted. But aside from about what I refer to as 10 minutes of a very mild fever, probably because I was taking cocodamol, and that probably was dampening any response to a fever. The only thing I had that was obviously a big, oh, this is probably COVID, was I lost my sense of smell, which was a bit weird. But when I went back to work after a week, because according to the trust guidelines, I could go back to work. I couldn't have a conversation with people. I got out of breath very, very quickly. And compared to a week earlier, I was not able to walk up to the bus stop and walk down from the bus stop. Even at that point, I was already having to minimise how far I was walking. And I was at work for a day before I went home, before I didn't come in the next day because I felt so ill. And my boss had said, do we need to take you downstairs? You're really struggling to have a conversation and breathe. So I was getting out of breath really easily. And I went home, and that was me. Didn't go back to work. So that would have been just after Easter. And I didn't go back to work until the end of May. Basically, I had 2 weeks of annual leave after a month of sick leave. My GP signed me off for a month. And during that month, I refused to go in and be assessed in hospital. But the GP was saying, look, I can hear you can't breathe on the phone. The staff say you're wheezy. And I said, I'm fine. And I wasn't fine. So a friend was picking up my prescriptions. So my GP wrote me a prescription for a stronger inhaler. And that seemed to help. I just said, look, my SATs are fine if I'm not talking to anybody. So I'll just sit here, relax, and not talk to anybody till I feel better. Because that was the thing, as being a nurse, I had all my own monitoring kit at home. And the doctor was like, okay, I will trust your judgment because they know me and they know how difficult I am. And then I went back to work at the end of May, and I had a very good boss. So we built it back up. I was absolutely struggling. I walked the 10 minutes downhill from the bus. I'd guarantee I'd be off the next day. So that started quite quickly. And then mid-June 2020, I suddenly went into a pain flare, and literally I was fine 1 minute, and the next minute I literally felt like I was going to be sick and had to go home. Phoned the doctor again, and he said, right, you need to have a few days off. And we had a discussion, and he put me back on gabapentin, which was not my idea of fun because I put on a lot of weight with gabapentin. I have done again, but there wasn't really an option. I wanted to stay working, and it seemed like it was the only thing. So I was back at work the next week, but it was becoming pretty obvious between then and July that I was not managing full-time hours. That on average, it was working out as 1 day a week. So I agreed to go on a temporary reduced hour contract, which financially was not the best plan in the world. And after this kicked in, it was working well. I woke up one day thinking, I've got a cold, I don't feel well, and I didn't go back to work that was the end of August 2020, didn't go back to work until February last year. I think that's around the time I got to know people in Long COVID Scotland as well. And I was just completely bemused by all of this. I couldn't do anything, and my symptoms kicked in, and I had the things everybody talks about, like the brain fog, the dizziness. I always think we have a chat here and there about how brain fog doesn't really describe what it is, but trying to explain to people, it's like your memory's not working properly. You can't find words. In my case, I was also experiencing tremors in my hands by this point. So I was finding it difficult to do things like embroidery, which I quite enjoy. And I couldn't sew because my hands would be shaking that much. And sometimes it needed 2 hands for a cup and all this kind of thing. But I had by that point discovered that everything that was going on with me, this COVID had made the pain worse. COVID had made my asthma worse. I still have not stepped down from that inhaler. I probably never will. I was unable to do my usual stop taking antihistamines when the hay fever season ended. I'm now on them permanently. And yeah, the pain aspect of it is just something that's there every day. I just deal with it and get on with it. But I imagine that your average person would probably be like, what fresh hell is this? And it's like, well, it's my normal. I've dealt with it before. But it's pretty brutal to have nerve-related pain and muscle pain all suddenly kick in at once, which was not my normal experience. And obviously since then I've had problems with my GI tract, and a lot of people report the nausea, and sometimes just you can't eat food because you're too tired. it's been a bit of a bore. And then after February, I got back to work, and then beginning of August, I went off sick again. So here I am, back off sick with long COVID. At this point, it's boring because it's boring. It is, as many people say, the gift that keeps on giving, even though you really don't want it to.
Yeah, I mean, the unpredictability of it is in some ways one of the hardest things to sort of deal with, isn't it? Because, you have better days, you have worse days, but you never know when they're going to come and when those sort of flares or relapses are going to kick in.
And on top of that, you have to consider everything that you actually do in terms of energy expenditure. But it's not as simple a case of pacing, because if we talk about spoon theory and how many spoons you have to do things in a day, on a good day, you have more spoons than you have on a bad day and when you relapse. And sometimes as well, if you are symptomatic, but you can work, you just physically can't go into the office, trying to explain, you're going to have to change things up a bit. You could work from home, but there's no way you have the energy to also get dressed and physically travel in. And sometimes people don't necessarily understand that. But yeah, sometimes you have to aggressively pace. So skip a bunch of things in favour of what you need to do.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. Yeah, absolutely. The idea of pacing is one that probably a lot of people with long COVID have at least heard of, if not being something that they're trying to put into practice. And from trying myself, it is incredibly difficult, even if you assume you have the same number of spoons every day. Is that something that you've been using for a long time, the pacing? And what sort of other things do you sort of use to make it possible to do the things that you have to do?
Well, I will be the first to admit, and I've since chatted to occupational therapy about this, I'm a boom and a bust kind of a person. If I have the energy miraculously to get shit done, as we say, then I use that energy to get shit done, even though I know I might pay for it the next day. And that's something that I have very much learned with COVID, and also in terms of pushing myself if I'm not feeling okay, but I feel I could go into work. It's something I've had to learn the hard way with long COVID, that my body just isn't doing that anymore. I've had to learn to think more about, well, how many of these tasks can I do in a day? And can I do them in a different way? The biggest thing I learned with COVID quite early on was that standing up in a shower and washing my hair and drying my hair would probably put me back in bed for the rest of the day. So one of the adjustments that I made there, I made 2 adjustments in terms of that. One of them was that I got a stool to sit in the shower. And the other was an excellent recommendation by a friend. She said, get yourself one of those hairdryer holders that's adjustable, because holding a hairdryer, you don't realize these things until it hits you. Holding a hairdryer and moving it around and drying your hair and moving your hair is quite heavy, and it's actually quite tiring. But if you have a hairdryer holder, yeah, you have to move your head around, you have to move the stand around, but it's a lot more, if you want to, for one of a word, putting it in sports terms, much more low impact than actually holding the hairdryer. And it does mean that is a lot easier, even with hair as long as mine. But you have to think about things like, but some days you literally have to think about whether you even have the spoons to shower, because sometimes you're in the position where I'm going to just have to top and tail. Clean the bits that need clean, because I don't really have the energy for anything else. And you have to think about the kind of clothing that you wear, because, you know, the more buttons and things they are, especially if your hands aren't working that well. And I'd experienced that with chronic pain. You know, sometimes it was like, it can be difficult to get down and get a zipper. So I had a few things like long shoe horns, and I'd also moved over to shoes that don't involve laces to close and things like that. So I had moved over to that. But you have to think in terms of, well, how can I minimize my energy expenditure? So that's kind of what I did. Oh, and an electric toothbrush. Yes, it's heavier, but dear God, fewer spoons than brushing your teeth just by doing this, because you're just holding the thing out and it does it. Yeah. So yeah, electric toothbrush, a stool, because the stool you can always use at the sink, and a hairdryer stand are the three most important weapons in my arsenal of personal care. As for other things, I was without my cleaner for a while. And partially that was because of lockdown, cleaner couldn't come. That was just a nightmare because I rely heavily on my cleaner. And then with my salary, I could not afford to have the cleaner in. And then last year when I got PIP, which I know we'll come on to, I was able to get my cleaner back, and that was fantastic. So once a fortnight, someone comes in and cleans my house for me, and they change my sheets. Because some of that I can do, but I can't change a duvet, things like that. So that makes a huge difference. I mean, I don't know, if you have a willing staff of children and a husband, then the thing to do is, I guess, to sit down with all the chores and go, right, here's what I can do because it's sitting down. Here's what I can occasionally do. Here's what I absolutely can't do. And OT were very helpful in terms of that, because obviously I have Ehlers-Danlos to consider as well, which does make things a little bit more complicated. The thing to do is just kind of like, you have to literally look at everything that you do. You have to think about everything that you do. And that's tiring. So when you're figuring out pacing, you have to actually put in time to rest while you are figuring out how much energy all of these tasks use. And sometimes you actually have to do them to figure that out, which is a bit of a nightmare. So I got a cleaner to do that, and as soon as I could, I reverted back to getting my big grocery shops, my main ones, delivered. I can occasionally go out, but I can't do that all the time. I can do that maybe, if I'm lucky, once a week. I could maybe go out and pop down. I have offers from friends to go and get things that I need. But the problem for me is I'm quite independent as well, and I don't like giving up that power. Don't like it. It's easier when it's grocery delivering because you're picking items. You know what you're getting. You don't necessarily know what your friends are going to pick. But yeah, so those are the big things that I have done that have really, really helped. Unfortunately, I don't have a dog to walk. I've just got 2 temperamental fur babies. It's easy enough to take care of them. Their food's always, I've set it up so that the food, I don't have to bend too much to actually get food out to then feed them. You know, I just have to deal with their boxes and all that kind of thing. And they're quite understanding. They're also very good hot water bottles. I miss cooking, but I can't stand up long enough to cook. I can sit down and prep food sometimes, depending on the energy, but then I wouldn't be able to cook it. So meals is mostly, if I want something fresh, it'll be a baked potato. So that's about as high tech as I get, or it's heating something up. So ready meals, tinned meals and soups are generally what I rely on. And I am in a bit of a tricky situation in that I am on my own. So if a friend offers to cook for me, then I get a nice meal. But most of the time, you know, it's the ready meal thing. And it's just something I've had to adjust to. Although discovering that there are some cake baking mixes that you can put in a bread machine, frankly, was the best thing since sliced bread. Yes, my bread machine arriving in the middle of lockdowns was probably one of the best things that happened, because I swear this was with pacing. There were days when I could put a mix and water in there and I could manage that and press on, but I couldn't manage figuring out all the ingredients and weighing them out separately and putting that. It literally, that is just, and I think people are like, really? And you're just like, yeah. And laundry is a case of, well, if I put the laundry in and I put it on, it may not get hung out till tomorrow. That's just how it goes, you know. I can wipe things down, but anything else than that is a bit of a stretch, really.
It's like tasks that a lot of people would just look at it as a simple task that they probably wouldn't even really consider. things like brushing your teeth, washing your hair, having a shower, chopping up veg. And then suddenly, when you have this sort of chronic fatigue kind of thing, before you even consider anything else, it just, you realise how many things that you do without thinking about them, don't you?
Oh yeah, and it's, you don't even realise, for example, I mean, I take medication 4 times a day, and I use one of these. I have done for a while because I'm on so much. I use one of these. But each time you take medication takes energy. And you have to factor that into your day. Eating and drinking takes energy. You know, a lot of people talk about, I'm absolutely exhausted after I've had a meal. And it's like, well, your body actually does, you don't notice it if you're not chronically ill, but actually your body, to digest everything, uses up a certain amount of energy to get you there. I mean, I always used to, if I played the flute at lunchtime on a Friday at school, you know, in lunch break, it's when we had band club, I would fall asleep in the first class of the afternoon, just because of the energy expenditure. But, you know, it's like when you don't realize until you've got you know, the fatigue aspect of this, how tiring absolutely everything is, and how much of a cost there is for everything. And it's something that I think people have to get their heads down, because you assume that it's not going to be like that forever, but with this particular condition, it is more chronic. It has more in common with ME and things like fibro that also have fatigue associated with it. And it is something that I think it's worthwhile saying to people is, pacing is actually, it's a skill for life. It's worthwhile that everybody learns it, and everybody learns about the energy and the impact of it, and the impact of a poor night's sleep on you the next day, because this is a skill you might need later on. And always just be mindful of everything that you do, because even if I get better than I am now and I'm back at work and I can drop into the shops on my way home from work much like I used to, I would still hope that I actually actively think about what I'm doing, so that I don't, you know, end up overdoing it and landing, you know, and having a relapse, because we don't know how long this is going to last.
It's definitely made us, I think, very appreciative of how easy we had it before. I think certainly for me, pre-COVID, I was completely healthy and just completely took that for granted, as I think probably a lot of other people did as well. And it's been a bit of an eye-opener for sure.
I mean, for me, I was already living with chronic conditions, and I had very bad days or very bad weeks. And I had already accepted that there were limitations, but nowhere near as many limitations as I have now. So I adjusted into my COVID normal, long COVID normal, probably easier than people who'd never had to think about this before, because I do understand that you have to get into this mind frame of a state of being with long COVID, because you're chronically ill. And I understood that. But for a lot of people, it's, oh, I'm ill, I'm going to get better. And you have to say to people, how would you cope if this, or maybe better than this, but still limited, is how you are going to live for the rest of your life? And I think a lot of people who've never dealt with disability or seen disability or experienced it themselves have found that very, very hard. They want to know when there's going to be an end date. And one of the things I think I've said in group many times is, have you considered that might not happen? And yes, you will grieve for who you were before, absolutely. But it doesn't mean that you aren't that person. It's, you will figure out ways to cope. You know, listen to people who suggest things like a stool in the kitchen, or parceling out the chores amongst your staff and that kind of thing, because that may be how it is. You know, yes, maybe running was your thing before. Maybe now it's going to have to be seated hot yoga via the internet. You know, you will find different things to get into. You will adjust. And you can talk about how you feel, and it's okay to grieve for that person. Absolutely, because I've grieved for that person. I used to run. I used to do a lot of sport. I used to go to the gym 4 times a week, not immediately before COVID. But I was I was fit, I was healthy, yes, I was big. I used to go gallivanting all over ancient ruins and all this kind of thing. That was my thing. And now I'm even more into shark documentaries than I was before, and I knit a lot. So I've had to adapt, and it takes time. That's all I can say. It does take time, and it's tricky.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I probably, like a lot of people, fought against it. When I got ill, a similar time to you, we didn't really realise what this was. I mean, maybe you might have done a lot earlier than I did, but I just thought, oh well, it'll be over in a month, because that's what I was being told.
Yeah.
And then the longer and longer it went on, I just kept fighting and fighting against it. And I had a lot of difficulty in adjusting from my life where I was very fit and active, and all of my hobbies were active hobbies, to being in a position where I can't really do any of those things. And it's really tough to deal with, and finding that sort of acceptance. Not necessarily that it's going to be like that forever, but certainly this is what you're like now, and you've got to sort of accept it and become okay with it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I probably calmer one because I've had the experience before. I've had post-viral issues before. I've had it twice in life. Once it lasted for a month, and once it lasted for 12 weeks, and once it lasted for a bit longer than that. But nothing compared to this. Absolutely nothing compared to this. And certainly it did not do a number on various body systems the way it has done this time. But as I said to people, people were saying, "Oh, you seem to be a lot more chilled out." And I said, "Well, my brain seems to function a lot slower now." And I also say, getting angry and stressed out about my situation and where I am, actually, it's a waste of energy that I don't have to waste. And I'm better off doing mindfulness and just go, well, I can't actually get dressed today. That's okay. It's not the end of the world if I can't get dressed today. And it's about adapting. It's about using, as the great Elizabeth Wurtzel used to say, it's about using every available resource, because there are more resources than people think there are. For example, if you've got kids, it's speak to friends who might be able to help out with school runs. It's about getting the grocery shopping delivered to the house. It's about, saying, I think we're going to need a cleaner once a fortnight to help out, and it's about all of the getting aids for around the house and all this kind of thing. And even maybe changing your wardrobe so that you've got smart clothes, but they're easier to put on, this kind of thing. And all kinds of things like, can I work from home? All that kind of jazz. It is about figuring out what those resources are and actually using them to make your life a bit easier. But it's a very tough mindset to actually to be able to get to that place. And everybody has their own journey with that. Some people find it easy, and other people like you find it really difficult, and it's okay to say, look, it was really difficult, and I'm angry that this happened, and I'm angry that is not my normal. But that's okay, because you're allowed to feel like that. You're allowed to grieve for that person. You're allowed to be angry at the situation that caused it to happen. That's entirely okay, and it's normal and healthy to express those feelings.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is, if you bottle it up, it almost makes it worse.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you mentioned earlier about being sort of quite independent, and I think I'm the same in a lot of ways, and asking for help was quite hard for me. I mean, I'm very lucky to have an incredibly supportive partner, but I still wanted to do things. And actually, I realised that a lot of things, actually, if I allowed him to do a lot of the cooking and all of the sort of chores, it just gave me a little bit, it lightened the load a little bit. And actually now I probably take him for granted. But, it's that sort of asking for help. I mean, family, friends, neighbours, I'm sure all of whom would be happy to help out. But certainly I would not want to ask.
I mean, I think when you do have a big loss of independence, there is a degree of loss of a sense of self. But I think society is very much set up around, people being independent, being on their own, they're able to do things, which is why we in the disabled community tend to refer to people without limiting conditions as ableds. And that's a mindset I think people are slowly starting to come round because so many people have long COVID and say, oh, actually, maybe we shouldn't think like this. And I think that's a very positive thing that's come out of this. I think it's less about what we should be able to do and more what we can do, what we are able to do. And I actually think less about pushing ourselves, to the absolute brink and collapsing, but actually, well, I want to have a well-rounded, active life. But in order to do that and not literally put myself in bed, how do I do that? And I know people have said they get things like gusto in or frozen veg in the freezer and frozen meat and all this kind of thing. It's about chipping away at how much energy you're putting out.
We'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much. Yeah, and not worrying about the things that can't get done. I mean, you mentioned putting the laundry on, and sometimes it doesn't get hung out till later, and that's okay.
Oh yeah, and forget about ironing. I mean, people were like, before COVID, were like, ironing? What's ironing? It's like, that's exactly the attitude to take. Screw ironing. But Marie Kondoing your drawers is a different kettle of fish. That gave me a great deal of satisfaction one afternoon. Just taking everything out of my drawers and redoing them. And then I spent the next day, I had to have a 2-hour nap, but there you go. Yeah, and you don't have to put everything away. Make folding and pairing socks a group activity, and then everybody's responsible for putting their own stuff away. And if you have kids and they decide they just want clean clothes and dirty mixed and strewn all about their bedroom, well, who cares? You've got one life, It's not the end of the world. As I say to my sister, if your 15-year-old son wants to live in squalor, let him live in squalor, And she's like, yes, but it's my house. And I said, yes, I understand that. I do understand. Invest in Febreze.
He's just practicing for uni anyway.
Getting back to sewing, I made loads and loads of masks. That was a really good thing. It's also a litmus test for me as to how fit I am for work, because the longer I can sit up in a chair at a sewing machine, it's a good indicator of how I could manage to sit up at a desk. And currently I can't do that, but that's life.
I'm really impressed. I can't, I'm trying to do cross stitch at the moment, and it's just it screws with my head.
The thing about cross stitch is there's a lot of counting involved. There's a lot of figuring out, and I didn't quite realise about the mental exertion of actually doing cross stitch. But then I had a big problem for a long time, and that my hands shook too much because you were randomly stabbing the fabric myself, and it was just, I was like, no, I'm going to go back to knitting. So far this year, I've finished 2 pairs of socks, and I'm working on a 3rd and a dog coat. Knitting's also, because you can do a bit and put it down, it's quite good. I like knitting, but I've been a knitter for a long time. I don't have to think about knitting. So
you've mentioned about your returns to work. I mean, how did you go about negotiating hours and things? You said that you'd got a very understanding boss, but was there a sort of official process or something you had to go through for that?
There definitely was. We initially, when I was ready to go back in May, the end of May 2020, I'd had a lot of experience of phased returns, thank God, but we weren't able to get an appointment, which was a bit tricky with occupational health. So I spoke to my boss and I said, we can play it by ear. And we came up between us with something that was reasonable. I also was very lucky in that I had a great union rep who was brilliantly supportive. And we got her to look over things. And at one point she said, I think you're being too adventurous. And it went back. So it worked out really well that, that we managed to get me back to work initially. But obviously I had problems with sustaining it because long COVID was kicking in. But the next time I came back, it was with occupational health support, and we had a conversation. She was very clear that it was going to be longer than a normal one, at least 6, if not 8 weeks. This had to be taken into account. Where I am, they're not keen on you using annual leave for it, because annual leave is annual leave. So they are very good in that respect. So it was worked out. She was also very clear the last time about my needing to blend working from home and working from the office where that was possible. So I had an agreement in place that I would work part of the time from home, part of the time from the office. And of course, I had the union behind me as well. So the union and Oki Health were both involved in that. And it actually went very well. And it was sustainable. I mean, it absolutely was sustainable. The problem obviously has been I have a relapsing remitting condition. And some days I have symptoms of other things that go wrong because of it. So yeah, but I think that you do have to have occupational health or a GP who knows what they're doing with the return to work. The other thing for me was that I already had a lot of things in place. I've got my own noise cancelling headphones because I'm autistic. I've got my own pink overlay for the screen because I'm dyslexic. And because I have a bad back and dodgy joints, I'd already seen physio. And physio had assessed me for a proper chair, and that was already in place. And I had an agreement because at the point in February, certainly last year, I was starting to use a rollator, and I'd said I will probably need to use this because sometimes I need to sit my backside down and rest. And there's not a lot of chairs in corridors. And they were really good about that, although I had to end up getting another rollator because the first one I had was a bit bulky, didn't fold properly. So I've got Rizzo Mark II now, and she actually folds up quite neatly and fits in, and it's a question of space in the house as well. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. That's a thing to think about, aids around the house and going shopping. And rollator is your best friend if you get tired easily. And it's the same thing if you go to work and you have long corridors to walk down. A rollator is not just useful for your balance, it's designed to be a chair you can sit down when you need to, where you need to. And quite honestly, if fatigue is a big thing, you have to sit down and rest. It really has made a huge difference to my working life and everything else, because I could put anything I needed to take around with me on this thing, but I could also sit down if I needed to. And I could sit outside so long as it wasn't too far. So I got permission to use that. And I do have long-term permission to use that, which is good, but it's what they refer to as a reasonable adjustment. And that's the thing about the law says you're allowed reasonable adjustments. I think if I demanded a single bed, that was adjustable with duvets so that I could take a nap, they'd probably and quite rightly say no. But most bigger workplaces should be set up with occupational therapy or, with the ability to call in a local team of people, because there's them in every city, or even the access to work people with the government to be able to put reasonable adjustments in place that aren't just about hours. I have been very lucky, but if I have encountered an issue, I've gone back to the union, and the union has supported me in getting things sorted out and getting things worked out. So it's definitely possible, and it's definitely possible to have a good experience of it. But again, it's a question of knowing your resources and using your resources. And that's really important. And also understanding that you may get back to work and things may be on their way, but not quite in place. And that's often the case, especially if you work in the public sector. And it's sometimes a question of hanging on in there, just hanging on in there, and reminding people that things are supposed to be in place if they've not been put in place.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about your setup where you've got occupational health and you've got a union, which is fantastic. And a lot of people will have access to those things. But is there anything that people can do, say they work for a small company that doesn't have access to these things, or perhaps they're self-employed? Is there any help for them in terms of similar options?
Well, I've obviously mainly worked with large organisations before nursing and during nursing. But I do know that Citizens Advice have a certain amount of information on their website. There is also ACAS as well. So people in smaller companies, it's worthwhile checking if you can join a union, but bear in mind that unions cannot help you with an issue that is ongoing at the time that you join. Yeah, and if you're self-employed, it's a slightly different thing. But the thing I would definitely tell people to check out is the Access to Work Fund for the government, because they can do things like, because I approached them back in January last year. It was all a bit trying to get a date and everything, and it did pan out in the end. I have a grant from Access to Work that basically I would find it too tiring to go to and from work with the walking and the bus journey. it would be physically exhausting. So I get a taxi to and from work, and I have a grant for that was paid for by the government. They also can provide grants for equipment. They also have counselling available as well, that they can put you in touch with things like this. So they have mental health guidance, in my case, via the phone. Although I was seeing somebody else at the time, so I didn't need them immediately, which was good. But there are things that they can do. And the application process was very, very smooth. Now, I don't know how it works for people who are self-employed, but certainly people who are with, it's a smaller company or whatever, it's something that they should look into. And certainly in Edinburgh, for example, you probably find that the local health board, if they obviously a smaller company is not going to have an occupational health service, but it's worthwhile looking into whether your local health board or similar, or even the council, actually offer, an occupational health service that you can get self-referred to or whatever. I was originally referred into the return to work service by my GP, and that was outside occupational health itself, because it's obviously run by occupational therapy. So there's ways and means of getting support if you don't work for a big company that maybe doesn't have all of these resources. And it could just be as well that if you are largely office-based, you may find it most comfortable. I mean, I expected to work at a desk in my spare room. I've got a lovely chair, bought a lovely chair for it. But actually, I've found that because I need to have my legs up because of dizziness, I mostly work on the sofa, and I have my office chair cushion behind me, and I have my legs up on cushions, and I have a lap tray. But I'm perfectly aligned. I get no strain, and I can work from the sofa, and I have a very nice view while I do it. So it's not necessarily, if you work from home and stuff, it's not actually necessarily a question of all this expensive equipment. It's actually a question of, are you actually in the right kind of position to work that's comfortable for you, that's not putting anything under strain? I was lucky enough to find that, a position that worked for me. But I do have my desk chair, and I've got my thing to keep my feet up underneath the desk and stuff if I need it. So again, it's about looking at what resources that you've got. But there are things out there. I mean, there may well be, if you aren't part of a union, is there a local advocacy group that you can speak to who might be able to support you with things like talking to your boss about things that you need, reminding them of the law, who also may know more than you do about local charities or government organisations that can help.
Yeah, and all of those things that you've just mentioned, I'll put links to them into the show notes so people can check out things like that.
I should also say that in terms of things like Unison advice and RCN advice about COVID and things like that, a lot of them publish their long COVID and return to work advice online. And you can actually look at that yourself. Obviously, you can't call Unison and say, I want you to come and look after me. But a lot of them do publish their advice publicly. And in a lot of cases, it very much talks about the law and what you're legally entitled to and that kind of thing. And it is worth a look, especially if you're not 100% sure of your rights and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, actually. A lot of people just won't be aware of partly what there is out there and also what they are entitled to ask for and to expect as well. I mean, I know that I didn't even realise I had a union until I needed it, and all of these things that actually exist that I just had never needed. So that's definitely worth saying.
One thing I always say to people, even if they're well, is join a union. Even if you never need them, it's the best money you will ever spend, because they are there to offer advice, and usually they come with all kinds of things that go along with that. Mine have been fantastic, and I don't think I would be where I am now in terms of work without my union. And I posted about that quite recently on Twitter, and it's been shared quite a few times, much to my surprise. But unions are great. And if you're in work, if you're listening to this and you don't have long COVID, join a union if you can. there's bound to be a union out there for you, but join a union. It's the best thing you can ever do. But yeah, you've got citizens' advice. If you are allowed to take somebody with you to meetings about returning to work. So if you have friends, family, cousins who either who are knowledgeable about this, or really sensible people, or who work for unions but might be able to support you, always go to a meeting with someone to support you. And actually, it's something we'll probably come to when we talk about benefits generally, is always have somebody with you, even if they're on the other end of a phone or on a Teams chat or Zoom chat or whatever. It's very, very important to have somebody who's got your back to support you.
Yeah, and you've very neatly taken us onto benefits and all of that stuff, for want of a better word. Because again, that's something else that a lot of people who now have long COVID would probably have very little knowledge of. Would you be able to just maybe run through a few different options that people are able to apply for if they find themselves out of work?
I mean, access to work kind of counts as a benefit. And that's an in-work benefit, obviously. And you can apply for that. You usually need sign off from people at work. Personal independence payment is the one I think that's going around quite a bit. And that is basically money to help you if you are finding it difficult to do things. And plenty of people hear the horror stories and all this kind of thing. It is quite common to be turned down first time. I was not. I was quite surprised by that. I got the standard amount with no mobility, which is what I was expecting, what I hoped for actually. And so I was quite lucky. I got exactly what I was looking for. And I think there's been a lot of questions recently about whether or not long COVID counts as a condition. And actually, it's not really necessarily about the conditions that you have. It's about how you are coping with activities of day-to-day living. So washing yourself, cooking, how you're managing doing those things, how far you can walk, what kind of mobility aids do you need, and whether or not you can do these things consistently and safely, basically. And I would say, if you have been, for at least a good long while, if you have been struggling to do things like cook and wash yourself, to definitely look into applying for PIP. There's also groups on Facebook and there's organisations like Benefits and Work who provide really detailed guides about how to apply for them. And my advice is definitely look into it. I always assumed I wasn't entitled to it, but as it turned out, I most definitely was. And it has made the biggest difference it's made for me is that it's obviously paid back in retrospect all the money I paid out for aids around the house, and also it's enabled me to get my cleaner back in, which frankly, I'd reached desperation by that point. So having the cleaner bag was brilliant. But that's the kind of thing that you can use PIP for. You can get PIP if you work. It's a myth to say that you have to be out of work. That's not what it's for. It's to enable your independence. So if you find it hard getting your socks on, you'd use PIP to pay for a sock aid, for example. You use it to pay for a stool in the shower if occupational therapy have not got you one. Other than that, obviously, it turns to out of work things. Some people may be able to take advantage of early pension. I don't have experience of that, but obviously the big one to look at is obviously things like universal credit and also statutory sick pay as well, which I think depending on how long you've worked, it will kick in at some point. I think financially, there's a lot of people who, like me, I mean, I'm exactly the same as everybody else. We're assuming we would keep working full time until we retired. And everything in life has been based around that. And like everybody, I'm worried about money. So it could be, it's worthwhile even, in terms of money, is actually speaking to banks and everything else about making your life a little bit easier if you are finding things like that difficult. It's definitely worth looking into, or citizens' advice and that kind of thing. There are organisations out there that can help. But benefits-wise, the one I have experience of is applying for PIP. But I do know that sometimes you have to appeal and so on and so forth. It's now largely online. You just do have to kind of read up beforehand that before everything comes, you do have to contact people and get evidence if evidence exists and that kind of thing. So but it's not as onerous as people expect it to be. And sometimes you can get quite pleasant surprises like I did. And other times, yes, you will have to appeal and have a mandatory reconsideration and all that kind of thing. And again, it does help if you have got guides like the ones I was talking about, and also using things like citizens' advice and advocacy groups to kind of support you with that. And one thing I would say is if when you get to the assessment point, have somebody with you. It's not necessarily that you're there speaking on your behalf, but even having that support there, they're also a witness, but it's also really important to have somebody with you, definitely.
Great. So yeah, be prepared and definitely appeal it. It's always worth appealing it.
If you get turned down, yeah.
So I think the other thing I was going to ask you about was sort of things like around communication. So, communicating conditions to others can be incredibly difficult, but I've learned kind of the hard way that it's important that they do understand what's going on with you, even if it's not sort of immediately obvious. The number of times people have said to me, "Oh, but you look fine." And maybe I do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I feel fine. And have you got any good ideas for sort of communicating?
I'm autistic. My communication skills are questionable at best. But over the years, I mean, as you can probably imagine, they do translate. If you don't look autistic, what does somebody autistic look like? I think the big ones that we get is, everybody gets a little bit tired. No, it's like, so one of the big things is communicating with friends up front, having chats with them and saying, here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do. Here are things I need you to consider. So let's go out for a day shopping. I'm going to be like, right, are we going by car? If we're going by car and we're going to like one of those out of town places, so we're going to be driving around it to the different spots, you can probably manage that, especially if someone else is doing your driving. Going for a wander through town, dealing with people and negotiating mobility aids, probably not. Trying to get people to think about how many steps are they getting into this place? How far is it from parking? And saying, I know this is a bore, but I want to do this. And also saying to people, listen, if I don't feel well, then I might have to cancel. And it can be very unpredictable. And there's no easy way of having this conversation, because we don't want to disappoint our friends, and we don't want our friends to think that we're boring. And I find it very difficult to say no to people. I've got much better about saying no to people. I said no to somebody who was saying, I want you to make me a bunch of face masks last week. And I said, no. I said, I'm not going to be able to do that. I don't feel very well. And a lot of the time it is difficult. I think trying to say to people is, people assume you're going to get, they say, oh, get well soon. That's something I hate people saying, especially if I have, like, prior to COVID, I had a pain flare. I once had someone ask me when I was going to be cured from a chronic lifelong condition. And my boss actually was the one that turned around to said individual and verbally flayed him alive, which I found quite entertaining actually at the time. I do often have to say to people, it's like, I'm not going to get better. Get well soon. I'm not going to get well soon. This will pass. It might pass. But I have a chronic condition. The thing to say to people is kind of like to gently say to them is, you're hopeful that one day you will get better. But at the moment, that's not the case. You are managing a chronic condition. That's a mindset that's hard to get into, by the way. My mother used to say that family members with chronic conditions were sick. And I had to say, no, they're managing chronic conditions. There is a big difference, because you have to take ownership of your chronic condition. Whereas if you're sick, you can kind of hand it off to other people. So it's the mindset. And to say to people this, I'm like this, it might be like this for a very long time. And sometimes you can only have this conversation when you yourself have accepted that. And that's that we have talked about that. So it is important to say it's a chronic condition. There are things I cannot do. I'd like it if you can bring things closer to me where possible. So cafes near your place, restaurants near your place, venues near your place, that kind of thing. Or even if it's just a case of they're all together, what my friends at work have done, which is really lovely when they've had like the office Christmas parties, is they'll call me on WhatsApp or they'll call me on Teams. They'll call me in so that I can be involved that way, sat on the sofa from home. They will literally phone me in to events. And that's a really sweet thing to do. So there's ways and means around it. But communicating the most important thing for people to understand is this is chronic. It maybe isn't going to be okay tomorrow, and you actually have to think about the impact of how things are going to be for you the next day. And it can be really hard. I mean, I can only imagine how difficult it is for people who've got children. You know, have gone from mum or dad, playing with them, taking them to the park all the time, and then mum and dad is, you know, going to bed with the 2-year-old for a couple of hours nap in the afternoon. You know, that. And kids are more resilient than people think, actually, to be fair. Kids can be really quite good. But other relatives can find that. I've got to say to a very lovely family relative who's invited me to a big family do down in London in April that I'm probably going to have to pass because would have to take extra time to travel, recover from the travel. Then they'd be the day, and I'd need to have somewhere I could go and lie down probably because I don't have much of a tolerance for it. Then I'd have to rest the next day and then travel back up. And I don't know if I'm going to be able, and that assumes that I'm all right. They're very difficult. It's very difficult. And sometimes I think you've just got to say it.
Yeah. I think a lot of people don't know what to say either. I mean, I've certainly found from speaking to, you know, family members, I mean, you know, they want you to be fine, and, you know, with the best will in the world, they're always going to say the wrong thing.
And you also, I know you get people who get frustrated that you're always like this, and it's, you know, I can say, well, you know, I'd like to be doing X, Y, and Z, but I can't. There we are. I try to be quite matter of fact. I mean, I know other people will find how you're struggling quite difficult to hear. And I think that's a natural response. But, you know, it's like when you say to people, look, this is my normal, and I have to work around that. So let's see if we can work around that. Here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do. And I think in some ways it's about saying, well, can we make this a team effort here? We're going to have to make adjustments because I can't do X, Y, and Z. But here's what I can do. You know, and a lot of it, people are, you know, they're hearing the can'ts. And I think if you start a conversation, well, here's what I can do. Can we work around that? And having an understanding that if you're not feeling well, you will have to cancel. And that if you are doing something and it's in a place, is there somewhere you can actually rest? And those are things that are absolutes that you can't, excuse my language, bugger about with. But the conversations will be difficult, and sometimes they'll go well and sometimes they won't. And I, you know, like I said, the other thing about the conversations about when you're having a flare and everything is to encourage people to say, well, I hope this passes soon. I hope you're back to your normal soon. Those are okay things to say. Although I hate the word normal. I don't want to be normal. I'm weird. But you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Back to your normal operating, you know, parameters. People, your usual operating parameters. People laugh when I say things like that. They say, "You sound like a computer." I said, well, fair dues.
Well, thank you so much for your time. That was amazing, and it's so helpful to hear you speak about, you know, the things that you've worked out and all of your knowledge around this. So I'm sure it'll be really helpful for anybody listening as well. So thank you so much.
Absolutely been my pleasure. Thank you for listening to me ramble.
Thank you so much to all of my guests, and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.